We survived. We were lucky. It was the sound of rain pattering against the canvas of the tent that had stuck with him, long after the guns went silent. The way the damp cold settled into his bones, seeping past the layers of mud and exhaustion, while the distant thunder echoed a rhythm so familiar it felt like part of his pulse. Normandy was behind him, or what was left of it. 6 months since the landing, yet the echoes of that beachhead never left his mind, nor did the faces. Paul had been 20 when he volunteered. Not because of some grand sense of heroism, but because staying home felt like cowardice. Or maybe it was the way his father stared at the radio each evening, jaw clenched, as the casualty lists grew longer. His mother had cried when he enlisted. She said he was too young. He hadn't argued. The war was not kind to 20-year-olds. It wasn't the fire that took pieces of him. It was the moments between the quiet after a burst of machine gun chatter when the world seemed too silent. Those were the moments when faces pressed against his memory. Charlie, who never made it past the hedgerows. Harris, with the lopsided grin and the lucky penny he'd clutched when a mortar came down. Then there was Teddy. Jesus, Teddy. They'd found him half buried in the mud, eyes wide open. Paul had shut them himself. It was in the town of St. Lo, after the bombardment, when he first saw her. She was hunched over a wounded man, Red Cross on her sleeve smeared with dirt and blood, blonde hair tucked under her scarf, hands steady, though her face was pale. She didn't look like she belonged there. Too young, too soft around the edges for this hell. But then she looked up, and their eyes met across the shattered street. And he knew she had seen things too. They didn't speak then. Not at first. But days later, when he'd been hit by shrapnel near Bastogne, it was her face he saw when he woke up in the aid station. Claire, that was her name. She worked in a mobile hospital, patching up broken men and writing letters home for those who wouldn't make it. Her voice was quiet, almost too quiet for the chaos around them. She told him he was lucky. He didn't feel lucky. It wasn't a love story, not then. Love felt too far away from that place. But there was something, brief touches, the way her hand lingered a second longer on his bandage. The way she said his name like she was afraid it might be the last time. They spent stolen moments in the shadows of the war, whispers of something that felt fragile. Then the orders came. His unit was moving east. There was no goodbye. Just the rain on the tent again, and the ache in his chest that wasn't from the wound. He left without looking back, and that was the last he saw of her. For a long, long time, the weeks bled together in the bitter cold. The push east felt endless, a slow grind of mud, hunger, and the constant percussion of distant artillery. Paul had stopped counting the towns. They all blurred together, just empty shells where life used to be. He thought less about home, more about making it through the next day. And yet, in the quiet hours when the sky hung low and gray, his mind drifted back to her. Claire. She hadn't been delicate like he first thought. He remembered the way her hands never trembled as she stitched a wound. She never flinched when the field hospital shook under the distant blasts. She'd learned to keep her face still, but sometimes he caught it, grief pressed so deep behind her eyes it could break a man in half. She had seen more death than most soldiers in their platoon, and she carried it in silence. A bitter part of him wondered if she even remembered him now. They were passing figures in a nightmare after all. But then came the letter. A crumpled envelope tucked into a pile of mail they hadn't seen in weeks. His name scrawled in careful, slanted handwriting. No return address. Just a few lines. I hope you're safe. I wanted you to know. I think about you sometimes. Stay alive. Please. It wasn't signed. It didn't have to be. He kept that letter folded in his breast pocket, right above his heart. Not for luck, just proof. That for a moment, somewhere in the middle of all this madness, he wasn't invisible. Then came the Ardennes. The snow was endless. Bitter wind cutting through their coats like knives. They were surrounded, supplies thin, the sky too thick with fog for air support. Paul remembered the hunger more than the fear, though both felt sharp. Nights blurred into days where the only heat was from the burning tanks scattered like dead animals in the snow. Men froze where they stood, rifles still clutched in their hands. Charlie would have laughed, called it a cruel joke. But Charlie wasn't there anymore. One morning, after too many days without sleep, Paul heard singing. Soft, faint, but real. He thought he was dreaming until he stumbled over the ridge and saw them. The Red Cross tents, pale gray against the frost. The nurses were still there, in the heart of the siege. His heart stuttered. He searched every face, half-dazed from exhaustion in the bitter wind. But she wasn't there. He stayed a moment too long, long enough for a mortar to strike too close. The blast left a ringing in his ears and a gash across his ribs. He remembered hands pressing against the wound, voices shouting, and then darkness. When he woke, he was back in the aid station. The same canvas tent, the same cold. But it wasn't Claire leaning over him this time. She was gone. Again. The war ended in spring, but the silence felt heavier than the gunfire ever had. Paul returned home with the taste of mud and iron still in his mouth, the weight of ghosts pressing against his chest. Streets once so familiar felt foreign now. Too clean, too bright, as if the world had forgotten the stench of burning fields and broken bodies. People clapped him on the shoulder, called him a hero. But he didn't feel like one. Heroes didn't come back haunted. For months, he drifted. Days spent working odd jobs that kept his hands busy, but his mind restless. Nights in dark bars where the whiskey didn't burn as much as it should have. And all the while, that folded letter stayed in his wallet, worn at the edges but still there. Proof she had been real. Claire. He searched in quiet ways. Asked around about the Red Cross units, wrote letters to places where the field hospitals had been last stationed. Most came back unanswered. The few that didn't only confirmed what he feared. Many nurses had been reassigned, scattered across the country after the surrender. He told himself to let it go, that they had been nothing but two people trying to survive a nightmare. But late at night, when sleep refused to come, he could still feel her fingertips brushing his wrist, still see her eyes in the half-light. Then, 2 years later, fate decided it wasn't finished with him. It was a town he barely remembered the name of. Indiana, maybe. Just passing through on his way to Chicago, another forgettable stop along another forgettable road. The diner was quiet, the kind of place where the jukebox hadn't worked in years. Paul had been halfway through his coffee when he saw her. She was by the window, hair longer now, but it was her. The same pale blue eyes, the same way she bit her lip while lost in thought. But there was a tiredness there too, like something fragile had settled behind the softness. His heart kicked hard against his ribs. He stood too quickly, nearly knocking over his cup. For a moment, he froze. What if she didn't remember? What if he was just another ghost she buried? But then she looked up, and everything else, the war, the endless nights, the ache, faded. She whispered his name like it was something she hadn't allowed herself to say aloud in a long, long time. They didn't speak much at first. Just the quiet hum of the diner around them, the steam rising from untouched coffee mugs. But in the silence, there was understanding. Shared scars. He learned she had left the Red Cross months after Bastogne. The things she'd seen had followed her home too. She worked now in a small clinic, trying to help people in quieter ways. Paul didn't ask why she never wrote again, and she didn't ask why he kept the letter all these years. Some things didn't need to be said. They were married that winter. A quiet ceremony, just close friends and a snowfall heavy enough to muffle the world. And though the nightmares lingered, though the echoes of gunfire never fully faded, they survived. Together. They were lucky. The years passed quietly, the way years often do when people try to mend what's broken. Paul never spoke much about the war. Not to his children, not even to Claire most days. But it lingered in the subtle ways. The way he flinched at sudden noises. How he kept his back to the wall in crowded rooms. How he never quite stopped scanning the horizon when they drove those long country roads, as if expecting something, someone, to come out of the tree line. But life carried on. The house they bought was small, on the edge of town where the fields stretched wide and the air smelled like earth after rain. Claire kept the garden wild with lavender and rosemary, and Paul built the porch swing himself. Sometimes, in the quiet hours before dusk, he'd sit there with her hand resting lightly in his, watching the sun melt low behind the hills. They had children, 2 boys, then a girl. And the world felt softer again, though never quite whole. Yet the past has a way of pressing in, even when the years grow long. One winter evening, long after the children were grown, a letter arrived. No return address, just like the one Claire had written so many years before. Paul unfolded it carefully, his hands trembling more than they used to. The handwriting was neat, unfamiliar. To Sergeant Paul Hastings. My name is Charles Decker. I served in the 5th Infantry, same division as yours. I've carried a debt for a long time, and I think you deserve the truth. I was there in St. Lo after the shelling. I was there when you were wounded at Bastogne, too. I saw the nurse you were looking for. I saw Claire. But I never told you the whole story. She asked me to. She thought you'd be safer not knowing. She left for England the day after. I'm sorry I kept that from you. It's haunted me, too. But you found each other, somehow. And I think that means something. We survived. We were lucky. I hope you found peace. Paul sat in silence for a long while after reading it. The house felt impossibly still, the only sound the slow ticking of the old clock Claire insisted they keep, even when it no longer kept proper time. When he told her, there were no tears. Just a long, knowing silence as she rested her hand over his. I was afraid, Paul. I thought, if you knew where I was, you might not come back. Or you might come back broken. So I let you go. I never stopped hoping you'd find me again. I just didn't know if you'd survive. Paul nodded, the words heavy but not bitter. Because somehow, against all odds, they had found their way back. Not heroes, not whole, but together. And in the end, that was enough. The years pressed on slow but relentless. Paul's hair turned silver, then white. His hands, once steady enough to thread a needle in the bitter cold, began to tremble. Claire's laugh grew softer too, her voice tinged with that quiet fragility age brings when the body tires before the heart does. They never spoke much about the past, not the war, not the letter. Some things stayed folded away, like old photographs tucked in a drawer where the edges yellowed with time. But the memories never truly left. Sometimes on autumn mornings when the mist clung low to the fields, Paul would feel it, like the ghost of gunpowder still lingered in the air. Or he'd hear the low crack of wood splitting in the fireplace and, for a heartbeat, mistake it for distant mortar fire. He never told Claire when the nightmares returned. But she knew. She knew when he woke in the middle of the night, breath ragged, staring at the ceiling as though searching for something just out of reach. She never asked, just traced gentle circles against his wrist until the trembling stopped. It was enough. Until it wasn't. The winter Paul fell ill was bitter, harsher than the others. Snow piled high against the windows, and the world outside seemed so quiet it felt like the air itself had frozen solid. Pneumonia, the doctor said. Claire stayed by his side, reading aloud from old letters and dog-eared paperbacks while the fire crackled low. She held his hand when he was too tired to speak, whispering fragments of stories, memories they had woven together over all those years. He drifted in and out of sleep, lost in that strange fever haze where time seemed to fold in on itself. Some nights, he thought he was back in the Ardennes, the snow pressing heavy against his chest. Other times, he swore he could hear Charlie laughing, that same easy grin in his voice. But always Claire was there. On his last night, the storm broke. The wind fell silent. The snow outside sparkled beneath a pale moonlight, the frost casting strange, delicate patterns on the windowpane. Claire sat beside him, her face half in shadow, eyes tired but calm. Paul's breath came slower now, each one a quiet effort. And then, with the last of his strength, he whispered the words he'd carried for so many years. We survived. We were lucky. Her hand tightened around his. And for the first time in a long while, Paul felt truly at peace. Claire stayed in the house after he was gone. The children came to visit, bringing stories and laughter, filling the quiet spaces he'd left behind. And sometimes in the stillness of the evening, when the wind stirred just right, she swore she could hear him. Not the ghost of a man broken by war, but the echo of a promise kept. We survived. We were lucky.